In one of the FBI's most striking tactics, agents learned early on that the fastest way into the minds of violent offenders was through vanity. Investigators would sit across from convicted predators and, instead of confronting them head-on, appeal to their sense of importance. They would say they wanted to study them, understand them, even learn from them. And again, it worked. Men who had spent years hiding behind silence suddenly agreed to talk to behavioral science experts, opening the door to some of the Bureau's most valuable criminal insight. What began as raw, anecdotal prison interviews eventually evolved into a far more structured system. By the time the Behavioral Analysis Unit refined its methods, interviewers were working through an extensive protocol of roughly 840 questions with every serial offender willing to cooperate. That questionnaire was not limited to one case or one event. It was repeated for every crime each offender admitted to, creating an extraordinary archive of motive, method, fantasy, and escalation. The scale of that effort became enormous. The original profiling pioneers interviewed 38 serial offenders, but over time that number reportedly expanded to around 1,500. Every conversation was captured on video and audio, then checked against real crime scene evidence to confirm what was true and what was self-serving fiction. As unsettling as it sounds, many of these offenders were eager to revisit their crimes in detail, and that willingness gave profilers a rare window into how they thought, planned, and justified what they had done. That growing behavioral library now serves as a core training tool for profilers and a practical guide in active investigations. When agents see a specific kind of entry, a particular way a victim was restrained, or a familiar pattern in how evidence was hidden, they can compare it to known behavior from hundreds of prior offenders. That is how profiling works at its most useful level, not just identifying what happened, but why it happened, and using that combination to narrow down who likely did it. That same framework is believed to be playing a major role in the Nancy Guthrie investigation. Despite how unusual the case appears, experts say rarity alone does not make it unsolvable. What matters most is behavior: what happened before the crime, what happened during it, and what followed after. And because elderly abductions are so uncommon, the case stands out as especially unusual, particularly since the more familiar drivers behind these crimes do not seem to fit neatly here. The suggestion is that investigators may have far more behavioral evidence than the public realizes, even if only a fraction of it has surfaced so far. Interview 2. Former FBI profiler and forensic linguist James Fitzgerald keeps returning to one haunting possibility in the Nancy Guthrie case, that this was never truly about Nancy alone, but about Savannah Guthrie. Not because Savannah did anything wrong, but because of who she is, the public world she occupies, and the possibility that someone obsessed with that world found Nancy to be the closest reachable target. In Fitzgerald's view, the case may sit less in the category of a classic ransom abduction and more in the territory of long-building fixation, grievance, and stalking behavior. That theory is shaped in part by Fitzgerald's own past experience. During his years working FBI cases in New York, he maintained close contact with security professionals connected to NBC and 30 Rock, where concerns about threats, unwanted attention, and troubling communications involving on-air personalities were far from rare. Back then it might have been disturbing letters or repeated phone calls. Today, the channels are broader and more immediate, stretching from email to direct messages to every form of digital outreach imaginable. His concern is that someone may have spent years orbiting Savannah's public life without ever gaining real access to it. Fitzgerald helped develop the Communicated Threat Assessment Database, known as CAT, a system built to collect and compare threatening language across an enormous volume of communications. That expertise makes his focus especially noteworthy. He believes investigators should comb through years of Savannah's incoming messages, not just recent ones, searching for recurring names, repeated phrasing, or a tone that changed over time from admiration to entitlement, then to anger. The goal would be to find someone who did not simply write once, but returned again and again, leaving behind a linguistic trail of obsession. Retired profiler Ray Carr has echoed that concern, stressing that grudges can simmer for astonishing lengths of time before they erupt. In his view, this may have started as a stalking dynamic directed at Savannah and only later transformed into something far more dangerous when the offender failed to get the access, recognition, or response he wanted. If that theory is correct, then Nancy's home may not have been chosen at random at all. It may have represented the most vulnerable opening into a world the offender could never truly enter. At the same time, behavioral analysis continues behind the scenes in ways the public may never fully see. Clemente has pointed to past examples, including his public profiling of Rex Heuermann years before arrest, as evidence of how much can be inferred from limited facts when those facts are matched against decades of offender interviews. By contrast, someone like Brian Koberger, in his view, is still too consumed by self-belief to offer investigators that kind of cooperation. The suggestion is that some offenders only start talking when time, prison, and obscurity begin to erode their certainty. Until then, the behavioral evidence has to speak for them. Interview 3. Fitzgerald's public message to the abductor was not soft, sympathetic, or even traditionally strategic. It was a calculated provocation. He essentially laid out the offender's current image in the harshest possible terms: a sexual deviant fixated on older women, someone driven by disturbing impulses and nothing more. Then he offered a challenge. If there was another explanation, if there was some motive the offender believes makes him look different or smarter or less pathetic, then he should put that story out into the world himself, anonymously if necessary. Otherwise, Fitzgerald suggested, this ugly version becomes the permanent legacy. That approach comes straight from the psychology of offenders who are obsessed not only with control, but with image. Many of the most infamous criminals in modern history wanted more than secrecy, they wanted interpretation. BTK flaunted his communications because he wanted to be seen as disciplined and superior. The Unabomber demanded his manifesto be read because he needed his violence to be framed as ideology rather than chaos. Fitzgerald's message appears designed to hit that same nerve, forcing this offender to confront the gap between how he may see himself and how the public is beginning to define him. According to Fitzgerald, there is every reason to believe the person responsible is following the coverage closely. He may be watching interviews, reading commentary, and tracking how experts describe him. Calling him a predator with a fixation on elderly women may not just be analysis, it may be bait. The hope is that if he has built an internal story that casts himself as misunderstood, justified, or somehow purposeful, then that public characterization could irritate him enough to react. As for Nancy Guthrie's fate, Fitzgerald has grown increasingly concerned that she may not have survived long after the abduction. The blood found on the front porch, the missing medication, and the complete absence of credible ransom communication all point, in his view, to a plan that may have gone sideways almost immediately. If the true motive was emotional or symbolic rather than financial, then the act of taking Nancy may itself have been the offender's objective, especially if it forced Savannah into public anguish and gave him the attention he had been unable to command any other way. That is why Fitzgerald remains deeply skeptical of the ransom notes that surfaced afterward. In his assessment, they look less like genuine kidnapping communications and more like opportunistic noise generated after a high-profile disappearance became national news. In a real abduction for money, he argues, there would typically have been contact that first night, proof of life, and a private structure for negotiation. None of that seems to have materialized here, which only deepens the suspicion that profit was never the real goal. Investigators, meanwhile, are still grinding through an overwhelming volume of leads. Tens of thousands of tips flooded in early, and more continue to arrive. People close to the case have described the current picture in bleak terms, suggesting there is very little concrete evidence to work from and that authorities are exploring every possible avenue, even the least conventional ones, simply because nothing can be left unchecked. Behind the scenes, DNA work continues, threat language databases are being reviewed, and the Behavioral Analysis Unit is applying decades of offender research to isolate the kind of person capable of this crime. At the center of it all remains Nancy Guthrie, a mother taken from her bed in the middle of the night while everything around her seemed still. The profilers now working the case are drawing on years spent studying some of the most dangerous minds in the country, hoping those patterns will eventually point to someone recognizable. Their belief is that this person has a type, a motive, and a behavioral signature that will matter to somebody, somewhere. And until that moment comes, the case remains painfully open, with the sense that the person responsible may still be watching, still listening, and still deciding how he wants the story to end.